I do think it's incredible how strong and how you've been able to cope, really. And I put that down to your really early years, childhood experience.
The air smelled of smoke and silence. In a locked chamber of the palace, a single flame swallowed lace, pearls, and dreams. It was Princess Diana's wedding dress, burning. Princess Catherine rushed in too late, her voice trembling, her tears unstoppable. Camilla stood nearby, the firelight flickering against her face. The sacred symbol of Diana's love was gone in moments, and with it, a part of Catherine's heart. The ashes told their story quietly, but the message was clear. This was no accident. Something dark had begun in the palace that day. The room of forgotten light. The evening light fell softly over the stone walls of Kensington Palace. The corridors were quiet, the kind of quiet that carried its voice. Princess Catherine walked slowly, her steps echoing faintly against the polished floor. She wasn't heading to a meeting or an engagement. Her destination was far more private, a place where the past still breathed. The door creaked as she opened it. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with old fabric and polish. Shelves lined the room, filled with carefully kept artifacts, tiaras that once glittered under palace chandeliers, faded portraits and delicate lace that had touched the skin of queens long gone. But Catherine's eyes went straight to one corner, a glass case standing in the dim light. Inside it, protected as if from time itself, was Princess Diana's wedding dress. The gown shimmered faintly even in the stillness, its silk folds resting like frozen waves. The long train, once carried by little boys who were now grown men, was carefully arranged beneath the glass. It looked untouched by years, and yet the air around it felt heavy, as though it remembered. Catherine stood there, her hands clasped before her. She had seen the dress before many times, yet every visit felt new, and every glance carried the same quiet ache. She whispered softly, "You must have looked like an angel that day." Her reflection in the glass met her gaze, a reflection that carried traces of Diana's warmth and grace. People said they shared something, not in looks, but in spirit. Both women had walked into the same world, a world that sparkled in public and bruised in private. Sometimes when Catherine came here alone, she felt as though the dress listened. It had witnessed love, joy, and heartbreak. It had seen the moment when a young girl believed in a fairy tale, and the years that slowly turned that dream into something else. Tonight, she lingered longer than usual. The palace had felt different lately, restless. There were murmurs of change, plans for a grand exhibition to celebrate the modern monarchy. Camilla had been speaking with advisors, suggesting updates, rearrangements, and new displays. Catherine had smiled politely through meetings, pretending the talk did not bother her, but deep down, she knew what it meant. Another step away from the memory of the woman who had once captured the world's heart. As she looked at the dress, a knot formed in her chest. They can change the walls, she thought quietly, but they cannot erase what she left behind. The silence was so complete that even her breathing sounded loud. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches above the glass. She could almost imagine the weight of the fabric, the whisper of the veil, the heartbeat of a bride who believed in love. She thought of William, how he never spoke much about that day, but how his eyes always softened when he saw pictures of his mother. Catherine often wondered what it must feel like to grow up with a love story the whole world mourned. A faint sound drew her back, footsteps in the corridor, a voice low, distant, familiar. "Her Majesty is requesting that the storeroom be prepared for review," one of the staff members said politely, peeking in. Catherine turned slightly. "Review?" she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. There's talk of including certain items in the new royal collection. I believe Her Majesty wants to reorganize some pieces." The words landed heavily. She forced a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said softly. When the door closed again, the stillness returned. But the peace was gone. Reorganize. Such a small word, yet it carried something sharp beneath it. The thought of this sacred place being disturbed made her uneasy. She turned back to the case and stared again at the gown. For a moment she felt as though the room itself sighed. The shadows deepened around the dress, the folds of fabric catching the last flicker of golden light before it faded completely. Catherine sat down on a small wooden bench nearby. Her heart felt heavy, but not with fear, with memory. She thought of all the times she had seen that same grace in Diana's old photographs. The soft smile, the kindness that reached even strangers, the loneliness hidden behind her eyes. She was never just a princess, Catherine murmured. She was a light that refused to dim. The air seemed to grow warmer with her words, as if the memory of Diana still lingered there, invisible yet alive. In that quiet room, surrounded by history and shadows, Catherine closed her eyes. She imagined the sound of wedding bells, the cheers of the crowd, the brightness of a young bride stepping into a destiny she never asked for. Then she opened her eyes and looked once more at the glass case. Something inside her shifted, a silent promise that she would protect that memory even if the palace walls changed and faces around her did not understand. Outside, the corridors began to fill with faint noise again, footsteps, distant laughter, the rustle of servants preparing for another royal day. But Catherine stayed still for a while longer, as though time itself had stopped for her. Finally, she rose, smoothing the front of her dress. She looked back one last time. The light caught the glass just right, and for an instant, it seemed as though Diana's gown shimmered, alive again, proud, unbroken. Catherine smiled faintly. "Rest easy," she whispered. "You're still here." Then she turned and walked out, closing the door gently behind her. The room fell back into silence, the kind of silence that holds secrets, memories, and love that refuses to fade. And as the lights dimmed completely, the last glow of sunset brushed against the glass case, making the old silk glisten like a single tear in the dark. Shadows in the Queen's room. The morning sun crept over Buckingham Palace, bathing its tall windows in gold. Inside, the grand ballroom had been turned into a sea of papers, sketches, and fabric samples. Assistants hurried in and out, their arms full of folders marked with royal crests. At the center of it all sat Queen Camilla, calm but commanding, her eyes following every detail with careful control. This was her project, the upcoming Royal Heritage Exhibition, meant to present the monarchy as strong, united, and renewed. She wanted elegance, not sentimentality. The modern monarchy, she called it. The phrase rolled easily off her tongue, yet it carried a quiet message. She leaned back in her chair, her pearls catching the light. "We must show the people the future, not the past," she said firmly, scanning the layout. Around her, a few aides nodded quickly, their pens moving in nervous rhythm. At the far end of the table sat Princess Catherine, hands folded neatly in her lap. She had been invited as a courtesy, though it did not feel like one. Her calm face hid a tangle of unease. She had heard whispers that parts of Princess Diana's collection might be moved or replaced, whispers she had hoped were untrue. Camilla turned a page in her binder and tapped a note with her pen. "This section," she said, "needs to be reconsidered. We do not need every gown or relic. Too many memories tied to a time that no longer serves the crown." Catherine's eyes lifted slowly. "You mean the Diana display?" Camilla looked up, her expression composed. "Not just hers, dear, but yes, it's grown a little outdated, do not you think?" The room fell into an uncomfortable stillness. Aides pretended to review their notes. Catherine's heart beat louder in her chest. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Those pieces are part of history. They still mean something to the people and to the family." Camilla smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "Of course they do. But history can be overwhelming if we cling to it for too long." Her tone was smooth, polite, and final. Yet Catherine caught the edge beneath it, a quiet irritation that had nothing to do with exhibition space and everything to do with the woman who came before her. Across the table, Prince William shifted slightly, his jaw tight. He avoided meeting his wife's gaze. Catherine knew why. He was torn, always torn, between duty to his father's reign and loyalty to the memory of his mother. Camilla continued outlining plans, her voice steady as she gave instructions. "Certain items can be removed. We'll reorganize the collection, keep what's essential, store the rest. It's time to make room for something new. The word reorganize hung in the air like a chill. Catherine blinked, trying to steady her voice. Which items will be removed? She asked carefully. Camilla flipped another page, pretending not to notice the tension rising. The list isn't final, she said airily, but among them, Diana's wedding dress. It draws unnecessary sentiment. The room seemed to stop breathing. One of the staff members dropped a pen. Catherine stared at her, disbelief washing through her. You cannot remove that, she said, her voice quiet but trembling. Camilla looked up, eyes cold but calm. It's a gown, Catherine. A beautiful one, yes, but still a gown. We cannot let symbols of tragedy define our future. William's hand brushed his chin, his expression unreadable. Catherine looked at him, hoping for support, but he only lowered his gaze. Camilla stood, smoothing her jacket. I understand how personal this must feel, but sentiment cannot lead the monarchy. It's time for change. Catherine wanted to speak again, to argue, to protect the one thing that still carried Diana's warmth. But the words caught in her throat. Her upbringing, her grace, they held her back. The silence between her and Camilla stretched thin and sharp. After a long pause, Camilla turned to her aides. Prepare the new list. We'll start the removal by next week. The Queen's order, remove unnecessary relics. Catherine's heart sank. It wasn't just about fabric and lace, it was about respect, memory, and the unspoken thread that tied her husband to his mother. When the meeting ended, she stood quietly, gathering her notes. The air in the room felt heavier now, the sunlight colder. Camilla walked past her with a polite smile. Do not worry, dear. We'll make something beautiful of it all, she said softly, her tone sugar-sweet but sharp underneath. Catherine nodded faintly, her voice barely a whisper. Of course. As everyone left, she lingered by the window. Outside, the palace gardens glowed in the afternoon sun, but she felt no warmth. She could almost see Diana in her mind, the way she had once walked through these same halls, full of light and laughter, unaware of the battles that would follow. Catherine pressed her hand against the cold glass. They do not understand, she murmured to herself. Some things aren't relics. Her reflection looked back at her, pale and uncertain. The corridors behind her were silent again, but her heart was not. Beneath her calm face, something restless stirred. Sorrow, anger, and helplessness tangled together. The next day, when staff began discussing logistics, Catherine said nothing. But as she passed through the hall where Diana's photograph still hung, she paused. Her eyes lingered on one image, Diana smiling, radiant, free, the fire that silenced the past. The morning began with rain over Windsor, a soft drizzle that blurred the palace windows and made the air thick with quiet. Queen Camilla arrived at the old royal storage wing wrapped in a pale coat, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. The corridors smelled faintly of dust and forgotten years. Behind her trailed a small team of aides, each holding clipboards and folders. The place was rarely visited. It held dresses, portraits, letters, and delicate pieces of the monarchy's long memory, things too fragile to display, but too important to discard. Camilla paused as a heavy door was unlocked, her expression calm but tight. Inside lay racks of gowns, shimmering under a thin layer of dust, their fabrics sleeping under dim yellow light. She took a slow breath, then said flatly, "Let's begin." For weeks she had been preparing for the grand exhibition that would celebrate the new face of the crown. Yet even in her triumph, the whispers followed her. Whispers of Diana, of the woman whose name still made hearts soften and heads bow. Every newspaper, every headline that praised her new royal project, seemed to carry a faint comparison. It was never about Camilla's reign alone. It was always about Diana's shadow. She moved deeper into the room, her voice echoing. Half these things haven't been seen in decades. We need to simplify, clear out what's unnecessary. Her assistants nodded quickly, taking notes. But her eyes had already found it, the large glass case standing near the back. The gown inside glimmered even in the dim light. Diana's wedding dress. The silk still glowed like it remembered the day the world watched her become a princess. Camilla stopped before it, her reflection merging with the glass. Her jaw tightened. One aide hesitated. Your Majesty, that dress is part of the late princess's private collection. It's been kept under preservation. I know what it is, Camilla interrupted softly, her voice calm but cold. Move it for inspection. It's been years. We'll decide later if it stays. The aide looked uncertain. Yes, ma'am, he murmured. As the team began sorting through trunks and shelves, the tension grew thicker. Camilla stood quietly, her thoughts clouded. She remembered years of headlines, faces that refused to forgive, the endless comparisons that painted her as the intruder. The admiration Diana still commanded felt like a weight she could never escape. She was gone decades ago, she said under her breath. Yet she still rules their hearts. One of the workers, nervous and fumbling, accidentally knocked over a small portable heater used to keep humidity from damaging old fabrics. It tipped, striking the corner of a crate. A flash of orange appeared, faint, almost invisible at first, licking at the edge of a curtain. Someone gasped. Fire! The room exploded into panic. The flames spread with terrifying speed, dancing across the dry fabric and wood. Shouts filled the air. Aides ran for extinguishers, tripping over boxes. The heat grew, fierce and alive. Camilla turned, her eyes wide. The smoke rose quickly, dark and choking. She tried to move forward, but the blaze had already reached the gown's case. The glass cracked with a sharp sound like shattering ice. Within seconds, the delicate silk caught fire. The fabric that once shimmered before millions now burned in silence, curling and blackening. The pearls along the hem melted into pale drops, the train turning to ash before anyone could save it. No, no, stop it, one staff member cried, trying to douse the flames, but it was too late. The fire devoured everything it touched, and when the sprinklers finally came alive, all that remained was smoke, water, and ruin. Camilla stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with the scent of burnt lace and wood. Someone rushed to her side, asking if she was all right. She did not answer. Her gaze stayed fixed on the blackened remains inside the broken case. By the time the fire was contained, the damage was irreversible. The dress, the most sacred relic of Diana's story, was gone. Outside, rain fell harder. The palace staff moved quickly to contain the news, but whispers were already spreading. That same afternoon, miles away, Princess Catherine was visiting a children's hospital. She laughed softly with the children, holding tiny hands, her heart light for the first time in weeks. Her phone buzzed quietly. An aide approached, his expression pale. "Your Royal Highness," he began hesitantly, "there's been an incident at the storage wing." She smiled faintly, unaware. "An incident?" The aide hesitated again, then whispered, "It's about the late princess's belongings. The dress, it caught fire." The words hit her like a blow. "What?" Her voice cracked. The hallway seemed to tilt. The laughter around her faded into silence. "The damage is total," he said softly. Catherine's face was drained of color. She took a step back, gripping a chair to steady herself. The sound of children playing in the distance felt distant, unreal. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." Her heart pounded wildly as she stared at the floor, disbelief turning to grief. She did not wait for further explanation. Within an hour, her car sped through the palace gates, rain splattering against the windows. When she arrived, smoke still lingered in the air. The once bright storage room was now a blackened shell. The scent of burnt silk clung to everything. She walked slowly toward the remains, her eyes filling with tears. Camilla stood nearby, her face pale, her voice low. "It was an accident," she said, almost pleading. Catherine said nothing. She looked at the ashes in the glass case, what was once a symbol of love, of innocence, of a mother's memory, and her lips trembled. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "Some things," she whispered, "should never have been touched." The room was silent except for the soft sound of rain hitting the windows. The fire was gone, but its shadow lingered, heavy, unspoken, and unforgettable. The night the palace went silent. The walls of Buckingham Palace stood tall and cold, holding their breath as the royal family gathered behind closed doors. The air inside was heavy, filled with whispers, unease, and the quiet sting of grief that no one dared to name aloud. Princess Catherine sat beside Prince William, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from holding back the tears that refused to stay hidden. Across the long, polished table sat Queen Camilla, perfectly composed, her posture unbending, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed hesitant to break it. Then Camilla spoke, her tone steady and almost rehearsed. "It was an unfortunate accident," she said, her voice echoing faintly. "No one intended harm. These things happen." Catherine's eyes lifted sharply, the words cut like glass. An accident, that's what she called it. The burning of the one thing that had carried Diana's memory like a sacred flame. The wedding dress wasn't just a gown. It was the heart of a story, the symbol of a mother her husband still missed every day. William's fingers brushed hers under the table, a quiet gesture of comfort, but it felt distant. His silence hurt her more than words ever could. She wanted him to speak, to defend what was lost, to defend the woman whose spirit still lingered in their lives. But he said nothing. His eyes were locked on the table, his expression torn between duty and sorrow. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his glasses. His face carried the weight of 1,000 thoughts, the crown, the chaos, the family falling apart under his roof. "Enough," he murmured finally, his voice hoarse. "We must not let grief turn to blame." But it already had. The blame filled the room like smoke. It curled in Catherine's chest, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to scream that it wasn't about blame. It was about love, about memory, about respect, but the words wouldn't come. Camilla looked at her calmly, her tone smooth and practiced. "I assure you, Catherine, the staff are devastated. I am too. We all valued her memory." Her memory. The phrase made Catherine's heart twist. It sounded so distant, so hollow, as if Diana were just another artifact lost to time. She saw nothing in Camilla's eyes that resembled regret, only control. William shifted slightly, his voice low. "People will ask questions," he said. "They already are." Charles rubbed his temples. "We will handle it. The official statement must be simple, a preservation mishap, nothing more." Catherine turned to him slowly, disbelief flickering across her face. "A mishap?" she whispered. "That dress meant everything. It was her story, your story, William's story, and now it's gone." Her voice broke, but no one spoke. Even William stayed quiet, his silence sharper than any argument. The meeting dragged on, words like reputation, control, and public perception floated through the room, meaningless against the ache in Catherine's chest. She barely heard them. Her mind kept drifting back to the blackened room, the ashes, the faint smell of burnt silk that clung to the air when she arrived that afternoon. When the meeting ended, Catherine stood quickly. The chair scraped softly against the marble floor. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice barely steady. She did not wait for anyone to stop her. She walked through the corridors of the palace, her heels echoing like faint heartbeats against the polished stone. She reached her private quarters and closed the door quietly behind her. For a moment, she simply stood there, motionless. Then the tears came. Silent at first, then heavier, unstoppable, raw. She pressed her hands against her face, but the sobs broke through. Everything she had tried to hold together, the calm smiles, the careful grace, collapsed. It wasn't just about the dress. It was about what it represented. Love lost, memories erased, and a wound reopened in the heart of her husband's family. Through the window, the night had settled deep and dark. The rain had stopped, and the stars glimmered faintly over London. Catherine stepped onto the balcony, the cool air brushing against her skin. Below, the palace gardens stretched in silence, their lamps glowing dimly in the mist. She looked up at the sky, eyes still wet, and whispered softly, "She did not deserve this." The stars flickered like distant candles, quiet witnesses to her pain. In that moment, Catherine felt as though the whole world was mourning with her, not just for a dress, but for everything that had been lost long ago. Behind her, the door creaked open. William's reflection appeared in the glass. He stood there, unsure, his face pale under the soft light. "Kate," he said gently. She did not turn around. "Do you remember her wedding?" she asked quietly. The way people looked at her, the way she smiled, that dress carried her dreams. William stepped closer. "I remember," he said. Catherine finally turned, her eyes filled with sorrow. And now it's gone. All because someone thought she still mattered too much. He reached for her hand, but she hesitated before letting him hold it. The silence between them said everything words couldn't. Far below, the wind moved through the trees, soft and sorrowful. The palace lights dimmed one by one, leaving the balcony bathed in silver moonlight. Catherine leaned against the railing, her fingers tracing the cool metal. "It's strange," she whispered, "how something made of silk could hold so much love." William looked at her quietly, his own eyes shining. "She'd want us to remember her with love, not pain," he said. Catherine nodded slowly, though her heart still ached. "I know," she whispered, "but tonight, I cannot stop feeling the loss." The stars above flickered brighter for a moment, as if listening. The palace stood silent around them, holding its secrets close. And as the night deepened, Catherine remained on the balcony, tears glistening like tiny lights, mourning not just for what was lost, but for the love that fire could never destroy. The Palace of Ashes. The world woke to smoke, not from the fire itself, but from the fury it left behind. Every headline screamed the same name, written in bold, burning letters that seemed to set the nation aflame again. Diana's dress destroyed, who is to blame? The story spread faster than the fire that had taken the gown. In the streets of London, people stopped to read, their faces twisting with disbelief. Outside Buckingham Palace, flowers piled up like waves of grief. Some came to mourn, others to protest. The air was thick with emotion, and the people's love for the late princess turned into something heavier, an ache that demanded answers. Inside the palace, silence ruled. Every corridor felt colder. Staff walked carefully, their eyes downcast. Conversations ended when footsteps approached. Even the air seemed afraid to move. In the heart of this stillness sat William. His office, usually bright with morning light, now felt shadowed and close. His hands were clenched on the edge of his desk as he stared at the photograph that always stayed beside him, his mother on her wedding day, radiant, full of hope. He barely heard the knock at the door before it opened. King Charles entered quietly, his face pale, his steps slow. He looked older than his years, his shoulders weighed down not by the crown, but by the storm around him. "William," he began softly. The sound of his name snapped something in William. He rose quickly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Do not," he said, his voice sharp. "Do not start with calm." Charles took a careful breath. "I came to talk, not argue." "Then tell me," William said, his voice rising, "how something like this could happen in your house. How the one thing, the one piece of her that was supposed to be safe, is now gone." The king's eyes flickered with pain. "It was an accident." William's hand struck the desk, the sound echoing through the room. "Do not call it that, not here, not to me." Charles's face tightened, but his tone stayed low. "You think I do not grieve for her? You think I haven't lived every day with the weight of her memory? You do not understand," William replied bitterly. "You never did." He moved closer, his voice trembling. "She's still loved by the world, by me, by Catherine, and every time people begin to heal, something happens that tears her memory apart again." Charles closed his eyes for a moment. "This family cannot survive another war of ghosts," he said quietly. "You and I both know what happens when anger takes root." William stepped back, shaking his head. "Peace doesn't come from silence, Father. It comes from the truth. And right now, truth is something no one in this family wants to face." He turned away before Charles could answer. The conversation was over, but the wound remained, raw, bleeding, unspoken. When the king left, the silence returned, heavy and hollow. William stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him. The world outside was watching, judging, whispering, but inside all he felt was a quiet, unbearable loss. Down the hall, Catherine sat alone in their private quarters. The sunlight through the curtains fell across her face, soft but distant. She hadn't been seen in public for days. The press called it grief. The palace called it rest. But in truth, she simply couldn't bear the faces, the questions, the sympathy, the unspoken blame. Her eyes drifted to the old wooden chest near the corner of the room, William's private chest. She had seen him open it before, late at night, when the world grew too heavy. Something inside had always drawn her to it. With trembling hands, she opened it. The faint scent of lavender and thyme rose from within. Neatly folded inside were letters, old, worn, some with smudged ink and tear marks. She lifted one gently, unfolding the delicate paper. "My darling boy," it began, "if you ever feel lost, remember that kindness will always guide you home. The world can be cruel to hearts that feel deeply, but never stop feeling." Catherine's breath caught. She read slowly, her eyes tracing the elegant handwriting. Each word carried warmth, yet sorrow. Diana's voice, soft, tender, almost alive, seemed to echo in the quiet room. She read another. "Sometimes love in this house feels like walking through fog. You see everyone, but no one truly sees you. Promise me, my boy, you'll never forget who you are when the fog grows thick." Catherine's tears fell silently onto the page. She felt a strange closeness, not to a myth or a figure in history, but to a woman, a mother, a soul who had felt the same loneliness she sometimes did within these walls. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the chest. Then she sat there for a long while, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes glistening. She understood now why William carried his mother's memory not as a story, but as a wound. The palace had not changed. The rooms were still grand. The walls still glittered with gold. But beneath all that beauty, it was still cold. The same cold Diana must have known. When William entered later, Catherine looked up at him. He seemed exhausted, his face pale and drawn. "She wrote to you," Catherine said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "I read them." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes I still hear her voice when I read them," he said. "It helps, until it doesn't." Catherine reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "She was hurting," she whispered, "and I think she'd hate seeing you hurt like this. I think she'd tell you to forgive, not because it's easy, but because she never wanted you to carry her pain." William looked away, his jaw tightening. "Forgive who?" he asked softly. "Her?" Catherine said nothing. Her silence was enough. The days that followed passed in quiet tension. Behind the palace gates, cameras flashed endlessly. The press demanded statements, apologies, explanations, but none came. Inside, the walls felt thinner, the air felt heavier, servants whispered in corners, guards exchanged glances. Something unseen had shifted, trust had cracked, leaving the family fragile and fractured. Camilla rarely left her rooms. When she did, her steps were quiet, her eyes darting away from anyone who looked too long. The weight of public hatred was nothing compared to the quiet rejection within the family itself. Charles spent long nights alone in his study. The light beneath his door stayed on until dawn, but no one dared knock. William and Catherine moved through the palace like shadows. They spoke little, smiled less. Yet in the silence between them, there was an understanding, the kind only shared by those who grieve the same ghost. One evening, Catherine stood by the window of their room, watching the fading sunset paint the sky in soft gold. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how something can burn and still leave so much behind." William looked at her, his voice tired but gentle. "You mean the dress?" She shook her head. "No, I mean her. I think she's still here, not in things, not in ashes, in love, in how we remember her." William's expression softened. He moved closer, resting his hand against hers. "Then we'll remember her right," he said. "Not as they tell us to, but as she truly was." And in that quiet promise, surrounded by walls that had seen too much sorrow, something shifted again. Not in the palace, but in them. Because even as cracks spread through those cold royal halls, in one small corner, a different kind of strength began to grow, quiet, human, unbreakable. The world outside still shouted for answers, but inside, Catherine and William were learning a truth Diana had always known, that love, even in its silence, could be the loudest rebellion of all. Love that survived the flames. The morning came quietly, cloaked in mist. The palace grounds lay still, wrapped in an uneasy calm that felt almost sacred. The air was cool, damp with the faint scent of rain and roses, as though the world itself had paused to hold its breath. Inside the small private chapel at Windsor, time seemed frozen. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with silence and sorrow. A single beam of light from the high stained glass window fell across the altar, resting gently on a small ivory urn. It was delicate and simple, yet it carried within it the ashes of what once made millions believe in fairy tales, the remains of Princess Diana's wedding dress. The fabric that once shimmered with hope and love had turned to dust. Now only the faintest fragments of lace and pearls remained, traces of a woman whose grace had never faded, even in death. Catherine stood quietly beside William, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her heart felt heavy but calm, her grief softened by the weight of so many memories. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pinned neatly behind her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady, filled with the kind of sadness that doesn't scream, it lingers. William stood tall beside her, his jaw tense, his gaze locked on the urn. The light caught his eyes, revealing pain he could no longer hide. This was not just a ceremony, it was a farewell. One more goodbye to the mother whose love still guided him. No reporters, no public eyes, only the few who had been part of this strange, sorrowful story. The king sat at the front, his expression unreadable, his shoulders stooped beneath the invisible weight of duty and regret. And then there was Camilla. She entered quietly, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor. Her presence made the air shift. Everyone turned slightly, not out of welcome, but out of discomfort. She felt it, every ounce of it, like a chill brushing against her skin. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She moved to her seat with care, her gloved hands trembling ever so slightly. For days she had dreaded this moment. The stares, the whispers, the silence. But nothing compared to the feeling that now sat inside her chest. Guilt. Not guilt from an action alone, but from the chain of choices and pride that had led here. She had wanted to be seen as worthy, as queenly, as equal to the woman whose memory still ruled the hearts of millions. But the fire had destroyed more than a dress. It had burned through the fragile peace she had tried so hard to build. As the priest began to speak, his voice was low, carrying gently through the small chapel. He spoke about loss, forgiveness, and the strength that comes from love that endures beyond time. But his words floated around the room like smoke, heard but not felt. Catherine's gaze never left the urn. The candle beside it flickered faintly, its flame small and fragile. For a moment she imagined the dress as it once was, flowing silk, the endless veil, the sparkle of jewels, and the radiant smile of a young woman stepping into a dream. She blinked back tears. That dress had not just been a gown, it had been a symbol of hope, of love's promise, and now it is gone. William's fingers brushed against hers, a silent comfort, a wordless strength. Across the room, Camilla sat still, watching the couple in silence. The sight of them, young, strong, bound by the very love she had once been accused of breaking, made her heart ache in ways she could not name. She wanted to stand, to say she was sorry, but the words passed away before they reached her lips. The priest closed the small book in his hands, and the ceremony drifted into stillness. No one moved. The silence was deep enough to hear every breath, every sigh. Then Catherine stepped forward. The click of her heels was soft, slow, steady. She stopped before the altar, her shadow falling across the small urn. The golden light from the stained glass window warmed her face, casting a faint glow that made her look almost ethereal. She lowered herself onto her knees. For a long time she did not speak. Her lips moved silently, her eyes glistening. The world around her faded until there was only her, and the memory of the woman she had never met, but felt she had always known. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, trembling. "You were loved," she whispered, "and you still are." Her words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. William's eyes filled with tears, and even Charles turned away, unable to watch. Catherine reached out a trembling hand, hovering just above the urn. She did not touch it. She did not need to. She could feel the presence of something greater there, something beyond what sight could offer. She took a deep breath and whispered again, this time with strength. "You live in him. You live with our children. You live in the kindness you left behind." William stepped closer, standing just behind her. "She'd be proud of you," he said softly, his voice breaking. Catherine looked up at him, a faint smile touching her tear-streaked face. "She'd be more proud of you," she replied. "You've carried her heart all this time." Across the chapel, Camilla's eyes shimmered. Her chest rose and fell quickly as she fought back her own tears. She knew this moment was not hers. She did not belong to it, not truly. Yet in that instant she wished she could undo everything. The rivalry, the pride, the choices that had built such walls. When the priest signaled the end of the service, everyone stood. Charles placed his hand gently on William's shoulder, but the touch went unacknowledged. Catherine turned slightly, her gaze falling on Camilla. Their eyes met, the first time since the fire. No words passed between them, but something in Catherine's eyes made Camilla falter. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't an accusation. It was something softer, understanding. Pain, yes, but mixed with grace. Catherine took a step forward, her voice quiet yet clear. "Some things are lost so that others can be found again," she said softly. "I think she'd want us to remember that." Camilla nodded, unable to speak, her throat tightening with emotion. The chapel doors opened, letting in the faint light of morning. Catherine reached for William's hand, and together they walked out. The sound of their footsteps echoed gently, fading into the courtyard beyond. Outside, the world looked different. The clouds had lifted, letting soft sunlight spill across the stone paths. The roses in the garden shimmered with dew, their petals trembling in the breeze. Catherine tilted her head upward. The wind brushed against her face, warm and light, almost like a touch. She closed her eyes and smiled faintly. Somewhere in that breeze she could almost feel her Diana, not gone, but watching, peaceful, proud. William turned to her, his fingers still intertwined with hers. "It feels lighter today," he said quietly. "It does," she whispered. "Maybe it's her." He nodded, his eyes softening. "Maybe it's us learning to let go." As they walked hand in hand through the gardens, the palace behind them seemed quieter, calmer, no longer echoing with grief, but with the fragile beginnings of healing. Back inside, the ivory urn sat beneath a single stream of golden light, untouched. The ashes inside no longer felt like remnants of loss, but like the roots of something enduring, love that had refused to die, even when burned to dust.